Believe it or not, on the most recent Joe Rogan Experience, they discussed the so-called final experiment. Take a listen to this.
Yeah, so this final experiment thing sent the world into a spiral. There was this dude, Jaron Campanella, who was one of the biggest influences, and he's said, I saw the sun above the horizon, I think the Earth's round. And he's immediately been, the Flat Earth Society's just gone into a head spin. They're saying they didn't really go to Antarctica. They went to the Sphere in Vegas, was one of the accusations. They did it at the Sphere in Vegas, and they were tracking it around.
The Sphere's not that big, kids.
Yeah, well...
It's not that big.
I've
been there. There's seats everywhere. You would know you're there.
I don't know. They had a bad time. But yeah, that's been pretty wild. Talking of pyramids.
Yeah, talking of pyramids. So anyway, I happened to be fortunate enough to interview Will Duffy, who was the organizer of this so-called final experiment. So I'll link to that in a pinned comment below. The thing is, for those of you who aren't aware of this, I was the first person to interview all of these flat earthers back in 2015. Some of them had done interviews elsewhere, but in terms of a weekly show, interviewing these flat earthers one by one, week after week, one after another, let's chat with these people, what are they talking about and why. Back in 2015, that was the Ball Earth Skeptic Roundtable, which I was fortunate enough to host. Guests on the show included Jaron Campanella, who was mentioned in that clip just then on Joe Rogan. Eric Dubé was on the show, Mark Sargent was on the show, Wakey Wakey, you name it. Anybody who was big in Flat Earth back in the middle of 2015, 10 years ago, they were on the show as a guest on the Ball Earth Skeptic Roundtable.
Ooh, that's interesting.
And so what we did at the end of that 12-week season was we invited all of them back for a special grand reunion episode that was a lot of fun. And I'll link to that in the pinned comment below as well if you want to go and check that out. I have re-uploaded it, even though the original YouTube channel that we were hosting all of our shows on was terminated by YouTube for community guideline strikes or whatever. I kept copies of all of them. So I've re-uploaded a few of those episodes, including the grand reunion special, which you can access right now if you are a member of johnlebon.com. But even if you're not a member of johnlebon.com, this episode of Bombersations is available publicly. My chat with Will Duffy, this was in the months leading up to this so-called final experiment. Now the thing is, the Ball Earth Skeptic Roundtable days, this was 10 years ago. This was back when the idea of flat Earth, for some of us, this was fun. Because what we were exploring was a new topic. Back then, this was new. Yes, there has supposedly been flat earthers for hundreds or thousands of years, they say. Okay, great. But in terms of this being a topic that people talk about and take seriously on the internet, that was back in 2015 that happened. And at that time, there was stuff that we didn't know. For example, can you fly between Australia and South America, or are those flights a hoax? There were flat earthers at that time saying that those flights were a hoax. They even said that if you could prove those flights did exist, it would destroy the flat Earth. You ever heard of this guy called Flat Earth Dave? Deep inside the rabbit hole, Dirth as some people call him. He's been on the Alex Jones show in the last 12 months. That's how big he's gotten. He was also on this show, the Ball Earth Skeptic Roundtable. He was one of the panelists. It was myself, David Weiss, another guy called Matrix Decode. We were the three regular people on the show, and then every week we got a new flat earther. And these guys were cool to talk to. Back in 2015, the flat earth people were fun to talk to. This is before the whole thing became a cult and a mind virus to take over the minds of innocent, gullible people. Well, anyway, back during that series, the Ball Earth Skeptic Roundtable, David Weiss said that if you could prove that flights existed between Australia and South America, that it would destroy the flat earth. This is all on record. I've got the documents.
A great way to prove that the earth is not a ball, or the earth is a ball, is to take a trip from the tip of Africa, or better yet, South America, to Australia or New Zealand, and see if it takes 12 hours or the amount of time it should take if the earth was a ball.
Crush the flat earth model.
It would add a lot of questions for sure, if not crush the flat earth model.
Shatter the flat earth explanation.
That would shatter the flat earth, explanation.
And this is one of the reasons why, even though I have some misgivings about the Ball Earth Skeptic Roundtable and the flat earth thing that became a cult in the following years, even though I've got some misgivings about being involved in it, I can listen back to these and I can remind myself, actually, at that time, all I was doing was saying, what is the evidence? These people with these ideas, what are their arguments? Let's sit and talk about it, have a discussion about it, have some fun, and that's what we did. Had we known back then that at some point in the future, there'd be some Will Duffy dude who'd come along and fund a trip to Antarctica, and that they would see the midnight sun when it's supposed to be there on the ball model, and that a lot of the leading flat earth people would turn around and deny it or pretend that they never said that that would destroy the flat earth. Had we known back then what we know now, things would have gone very differently. How was I supposed to know that most so-called awake people are really just as blind as the moron masses, and they just believe whatever stories make them happy, and they don't care the least bit about the evidence or the logic? How was I supposed to know that back then? I was young, I was naive. Look at me, look at that smile on my face. I was a happy dude, and I was happy to be talking with all of these people, and I had no idea that the whole thing would turn into a cult and a mind virus and really a disaster. I had no idea at that time. But anyway, if you want to listen to this episode and other episodes of the Boiler Skeptic Roundtable, I've got them all on file. You can check that out at johnthebond.com if you're a member of the site. If you're not a member, go and check out my chat with Will Duffy from September of last year. He's the guy who organised this final experiment. And as for Joe Rogan and his chat with Chris Williamson, big thanks to Hilly from Minnesota who made me aware of this. This was only published an hour or two ago. And Hilly sent me an email to say, hey, they're talking about the final experiment on Joe Rogan, so thank you, Hilly. And as I understand it, once they finish talking about the final experiment, they start talking about ancient Egypt and all these ancient artifacts, thousands of years old. That's the kind of stuff the normies believe, the regular people believe, including Joe Rogan and his millions of listeners and followers. They believe in ancient history and all this kind of stuff. Really, it's a schmozzle, folks. But I don't have time to talk about that right now. Go and check the links in the pinned comment below and let me know your thoughts, folks. What do you think about Joe Rogan giving any airtime to the final experiment? And what do you think about the fact, if this is news to you, that your main man JLB back in 2015 was chatting with Mark Sargent, Jaron Campanella, Eric Dubé, the Morgile, man, that takes me back, D Murphy 25, Wakey, of course, deep inside the rabbit holes on the show back then. What do you think about it? If you're not aware of that, I'm telling you, it's there. I've got the documents. It's all on the record. The first show to chat with Flat Earthers every week. We had a 12-week series, and it was a lot of fun, like I said. But at that time, we just didn't. I had no way of knowing that this wasn't just a topic to talk about for some people. It was the beginning of a cult that would take over people's minds. And 10 years later, there would still be well-meaning fools holding on to their bullshit flat earth. Goodness gracious me.